You now understand what doesn't work. You know what practice looks like when it aligns with neurobiology. But there's another level. There are specific techniques, specific methods that don't just make learning effective. They make it fast. They force your brain to rewire at an accelerated speed. These aren't tips. These are cognitive power tools. They're ways of engaging with information that create multiple pathways, deeper encoding, and faster consolidation. They transform you from a passive consumer of knowledge into an active constructor of understanding. And that shift, from consumer to constructor, is where high-speed learning lives. Let's build those circuits. Prediction before input multiplies learning. Before you learn something, predict what you're about to learn. Before you read the next paragraph, guess what it will say. Before you watch the demonstration, imagine how it will unfold. Before you hear the answer, try to answer the question yourself. This seems backward. How can you predict something you don't know yet? But that's exactly the point. The act of prediction, even when it's wrong, primes your brain in a powerful way. When you make a prediction, you activate relevant neural networks. You pull up everything you already know about the topic. You create an expectation. And then when the actual information arrives, your brain doesn't just passively receive it. It compares it to your prediction. It notices what matches and what doesn't. It identifies the gaps. It updates your model. This comparison process is incredibly powerful for learning. It creates what neuroscientists call an error signal, a mismatch between expectation and reality. And error signals drive plasticity. They tell your brain what needs to change. Studies show that students who predict before learning retain more and understand deeper than students who simply receive information directly. The prediction creates engagement. It transforms passive reception into active construction. So make prediction a habit. Before every learning moment, pause and predict. It takes seconds, and those seconds multiply the effectiveness of everything that follows. Because prediction before input doesn't just prepare your brain to learn, it forces your brain to learn. Mental rehearsal activates motor maps. You don't need to physically practice something to strengthen the neural circuits that control it. You can practice in your mind. And remarkably, your brain treats mental rehearsal almost like physical rehearsal. When you vividly imagine performing a movement, the motor cortex, the part of your brain that controls that movement, activates. Not as strongly as during actual movement, but significantly. Studies using brain imaging show that mental practice lights up the same regions as physical practice. This means mental rehearsal isn't just visualization. It's actual neural training. You're activating the motor maps. You're strengthening the pathways. You're building the circuit even when your body is still. Athletes use this constantly. A basketball player visualizes free throws before sleep. A gymnast mentally rehearses a routine before competing. They're not just building confidence. They're building neural infrastructure. You can do this with any skill. Before you physically practice, spend a few minutes mentally rehearsing. See it, feel it. Imagine the movements in vivid detail. What does your body do? What does success feel like? Run through the sequence in your mind. And here's the bonus. You can do this anywhere, lying in bed, sitting on a bus, waiting in line. Your brain doesn't need your body to be moving to build motor circuits. Mental rehearsal activates motor maps, and activated maps get stronger. Multisensory, encoding multiplies retrieval paths. Your brain stores memories across multiple systems. Visual information goes one place. Auditory information goes another way. Kinesthetic information somewhere else. And when you encode something using multiple senses, you create multiple retrieval paths. Think of it like this. If you learn something only visually, you have one pathway to that memory. But if you learn it visually, auditorily, and kinesthetically, you have three pathways. And if any one of those pathways gets triggered, you can retrieve the memory. This is why learning is more effective when it engages multiple senses. When you read something, say it out loud and write it down, you're encoding it three different ways: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Each one creates a separate trace. Each trace becomes a potential retrieval route. And it compounds. The more senses you involve, the more associations you create, the more robust the memory becomes. It's not just redundancy, it's multiple angles of attack on the same information. So when you're learning something important, don't just use one sense. Read it, speak it, write it, draw it, move to it. Involve as many sensory systems as possible. You're not just repeating the information. You're weaving it into your brain from multiple directions. And when it's time to retrieve it, you'll have a dozen paths to pull it back up. Dual coding stabilizes recall. Dual coding means representing information in two formats: verbal and visual, words and images, language and pictures. And when you encode something in both formats, you dramatically improve retention and recall. Here's why. Verbal and visual information are processed by different systems in your brain. When you learn something verbally, you're using language networks. When you learn it visually, you're using visual spatial networks. And when you encode it in both formats, both systems store it. This creates redundancy, but it's more than that. The two formats interact. They reinforce each other. The visual representation helps you understand the verbal description. The verbal description helps you interpret the visual representation. They create a richer, more stable mental model. Research consistently shows that students who combine words and diagrams outperform students who use either alone. The dual coding group remembers more, understands deeper, and transfers better. So when you're learning, don't just read the text or just look at the diagram. Do both. And better yet, create your own diagrams. Draw your own pictures. Translate the verbal information into visual form. That translation process, that act of dual coding, forces deep processing. And deep processing creates stable recall. Handwriting deepens abstraction. Typing is fast. Typing is efficient. You can capture everything word for word. But handwriting, slow and inefficient as it is, produces better learning. When you type, you can transcribe without thinking. Your fingers move automatically. You can record information without processing it. But when you write by hand, you can't keep up. You're forced to select. You have to decide what's important. You have to paraphrase. You have to compress. And that compression, that act of translating someone else's words into your own, forces you to think, to understand, to abstract the core meaning. You're not just recording, you're processing. Studies comparing note-taking methods consistently find the same result. Students who take notes by hand perform better on conceptual questions than students who type. The typing group records more information, but they understand less. The handwriting group records less, but they comprehend more. There's also a motor component. The physical act of forming letters, the unique pattern of movements for each word, creates a kinesthetic memory trace that typing doesn't provide. Your hand remembers what your mind might forget. So when you're learning something conceptual, something you need to understand deeply, handwrite it. Force yourself to slow down. Force yourself to think. Force yourself to translate. Because handwriting isn't just recording. Handwriting deepens abstraction, and abstraction is understanding. Concept mapping mirrors neural structure. Your brain doesn't store information in lists. It stores information in networks. Concepts are linked to other concepts. Ideas connected to ideas. Knowledge as a web, not a stack. When you create a concept map, when you draw boxes and arrows showing how ideas relate to each other, you're externalizing your brain's internal structure. You're making the network visible. And that process of mapping, of deciding which concepts connect and how they connect, forces you to think about relationships, hierarchies, structure. This is deeper than linear note-taking. A list tells you what things are. A concept map tells you how things relate, and relationships are where understanding lives. Creating a concept map forces you to ask questions that passive reading never prompts. How does this connect to that? Which concept is more fundamental? What's the causal relationship? What's an example of this principle? You're not just absorbing information, you're building structure. And here's the key. The structure you build externally helps your brain build structure internally. As you arrange concepts on paper, your brain is arranging them in neural space. You're literally helping your brain organize itself. So when you're learning complex material, don't just highlight, map it, draw the concepts, connect them, show the relationships visually. You're not just studying, you're mirroring neural structure. And when your external map matches your internal map, recall becomes effortless. Teaching forces structural encoding. You haven't truly learned something until you can teach it. This isn't just a saying, it's a neurological reality. When you prepare to teach, your brain does something different than when you prepare to be tested. Teaching requires you to anticipate questions, to explain not just what but why, to create examples, to find multiple ways of expressing the same idea. You can't just memorize, you have to understand. This preparation process forces structural encoding. You're not just storing isolated facts. You're building a coherent framework that you can explain to someone else. You're organizing knowledge in a way that makes sense narratively, causally, logically. And when you actually teach, when you explain something out loud to another person, you discover gaps in your understanding immediately. You stumble. You can't find the right words. You realize you don't actually know this as well as you thought. And that realization is valuable. It tells you exactly where to focus your learning. Research shows that students who study with the expectation of teaching learn more and retain longer than students who study with the expectation of being tested. The teaching mindset changes how you engage with the material. So even if you don't have anyone to teach, pretend you do. Study as if you'll have to explain this to someone tomorrow. Create explanations out loud. Imagine the questions they'd ask. Answer them. Because teaching, even imaginary teaching, forces structural encoding. And structural encoding is how knowledge becomes wisdom. Naming pattern stabilizes control. When you encounter a pattern repeatedly but you don't have a name for it, your brain treats each instance as separate. But the moment you name the pattern, the moment you give it a label, something shifts. Now all those separate instances collapse into one concept, and that concept becomes a tool you can wield consciously. This is why learning terminology is so powerful. It's not just memorizing jargon, it's gaining control. When you learn the term confirmation bias, you don't just understand the concept. You start noticing it everywhere. You can identify it in your own thinking. You can call it out in arguments. The name gives you a handle. This applies to skills too. When a coach names a technique, when they say you're dropping your elbow or that's a cross step, they're giving you conscious access to something that was happening below awareness. Now you can monitor it, adjust it, control it. Naming patterns stabilizes control. It brings unconscious processes into conscious awareness. And once something is conscious, you can modify it deliberately. So when you're learning, pay attention to patterns. When you notice something recurring, name it. Create your own terminology if necessary. Give the pattern a label, because the act of naming transforms recognition into control, and control is where mastery begins. Rule discovery outperforms rule delivery. You can tell someone a rule and they'll remember it temporarily. But if they discover the rule themselves, they'll own it permanently. This is the difference between being told I before E except after C and noticing on your own that certain words follow a pattern. When you discover a rule, you're not just receiving information. You're constructing understanding. Your brain is actively finding the pattern, testing it, confirming it. And that active process creates deep encoding. Studies on learning consistently show that discovery-based learning, where students are given examples and asked to figure out the underlying principle, produces better long-term retention and transfer than direct instruction. It takes longer. It feels less efficient, but the learning is deeper. This is because discovery engages your pattern recognition systems. You're not just memorizing someone else's abstraction. You're creating your own. And the process of creation, the struggle to find the pattern, is what makes it stick. So when you're learning, resist the urge to jump straight to the explanation. Look at examples first. Try to figure out the pattern yourself. What do these have in common? What's the underlying rule? Make a guess. Test it. Refine it. And only after you've genuinely tried to discover it yourself, then look at the explanation. Because rule discovery outperforms rule delivery, not because the rule is different, but because the process of discovery builds neural architecture that passive reception never can. Pattern hunting accelerates compression. Compression, as we talked about earlier, is the hallmark of mastery. Experts don't know more facts than novices. They've compressed the facts into deeper patterns. And you can accelerate this compression by actively hunting for patterns. Pattern hunting means constantly asking yourself, what's the pattern here? What stays the same across these different examples? What's the core principle underneath the surface variation? You're not just learning individual instances. You're searching for the structure that unifies them. This is what mathematicians do. They don't memorize every possible equation. They recognize families of equations, patterns of structure. This is what chess masters do. They don't memorize every possible board position. They recognize strategic patterns that apply across thousands of positions. And you can do this in any domain. When you're learning vocabulary, don't just memorize words. Look for roots, prefixes, patterns of meaning. When you're learning code, don't just copy syntax. Look for design patterns, recurring structures. When you're learning history, don't just memorize dates. Look for patterns of cause and effect, cycles that repeat. Every time you identify a pattern, you compress dozens or hundreds of individual facts into a single principle. Your mental model becomes leaner, more efficient, more powerful. And that efficiency is what allows experts to process information so quickly. They're not thinking faster. They're thinking at a higher level of compression. So make pattern hunting a deliberate practice. After every learning session, ask yourself, what patterns did I notice? What's the deeper structure? Keep a pattern journal if you need to, because pattern hunting accelerates compression, and compression is the express lane to mastery. You're not a consumer anymore. You're a constructor. You predict before you learn. You rehearse mentally. You encode multisensorially. You dual code. You handwrite to think. You map concepts. You teach. You name patterns. You discover rules. You hunt for structure. These aren't passive activities. These are active interventions in your own learning process. You're not waiting for your brain to learn. You're forcing it to build high-speed circuits. You're engineering the conditions where deep encoding happens fast. This is what separates fast learners from slow learners. Not talent, not intelligence, method. Fast learners use techniques that multiply learning. They engage with information in ways that create multiple pathways, deeper encoding, and faster consolidation. They've turned learning from something that happens to them into something they make happen. And now so can you.